This atrocious tale, set in England, has evolved into one of the nation's most notorious criminal incidents over time. A young lady was slain while strolling in the park with her toddler. Her only observer was her child, and law enforcement struggled to identify the perpetrator for 16 years. When the case was finally resolved, the police faced allegations of disastrous incompetence. It was revealed that they had committed a multitude of errors that had resulted in the loss of several lives. Rachel Jane Nichol was born on November 23, 1968, in a village near Colchester, England. She grew up in a decent, full family. Her father was an army officer, and her mother a housewife. From an early age, the young woman took part in various volunteer programs, helping the elderly and children with disabilities. At age 11, she enrolled at Colchester High School for Girls, where she was active in dance, singing, and acting. All of her teachers insisted that the young woman had real talent and should develop in that direction. However, Rachel herself was more deeply into the study of history and English. After school, she got a job as a lifeguard at the pool in Richmond. Rachel later planned to try her hand at hosting a television program for children. In 1988, when she was 20 years old, Rachel met her future husband, Andre. The couple began dating, and a year later, they had a son, Alex, together. They moved to an area of London called Balham. By then, she had already been offered a job as a model, but she decided to devote her full attention to her family for a few years and then try to get a job in television. On a summer morning, July 15, 1992, Rachel took her son and their Labrador for a walk in the local park. At the time, Alex was only a month away from his 3rd birthday. This park in Wimbledon Common neighborhood was popular with the locals. There were always a lot of people there during the daytime, mostly parents with children and dog walkers. Despite this, because of the large area and the abundance of greenery, it was always possible to get away from prying eyes and enjoy nature and solitude. Regrettably, there was a downside to this situation. At approximately 10:30 a.m., a woman strolling in the park stumbled upon a horrifying sight. A young woman was sprawled on the ground, surrounded by a pool of blood, with a small child sitting beside her. The victim turned out to be Rachel. Dozens of police officers swiftly arrived at the scene, having to secure an area of 4 square kilometers where numerous potential witnesses and the possible killer were present. Detectives soon discovered that none of the park's visitors had witnessed the attack or the perpetrator, except for one witness: Rachel's son, Alex. Extracting information from the 2-year-old boy proved to be an extremely challenging task. Initially, the child was taken to the hospital for a thorough examination to ensure he was unharmed. Subsequently, detectives managed to gather some details from him. According to Alex, he and his mother were approached by a tall, thin white man with brown hair. Every individual in the park was interrogated. The police spent nearly an entire day on this task, while it took only a few hours for the news of this gruesome crime to spread throughout the country. Rachel's case immediately sparked widespread outrage, which was not surprising given that a young mother had been killed in front of her child in one of London's most popular parks. The residents of Britain were further shocked when details from the pathologist's report were leaked by the newspapers. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times with a sharp object. The Metropolitan Police faced immense pressure. The public demanded swift apprehension and punishment of the perpetrator, leading the detectives to work at an accelerated pace. In the initial weeks, 548 men were interviewed, with 32 of them even being briefly detained. Yet all efforts proved futile. The police were at a dead end, with the only potential lead being a minuscule piece of organic material that they suspected might be linked to the killer. Unfortunately, the technology available in 1992 was insufficient for further analysis. In September, investigators found themselves without any suspects, prompting them to seek the expertise of Paul Britton, a well-known profiler, to create a profile of the killer. Britton's description painted a picture of a man in his late 20s to early 30s, likely living alone, with socially unrelated hobbies such as knives and the occult and sadistic fantasies. The profile also indicated that the killer lived near the park. Following the police department's request, this profile, along with a sketch, was broadcasted on television. Subsequently, they received multiple calls, all pointing to the same individual, Colin Stagg. Not only did Stagg match the sketch, but the police also discovered that he was already on their radar. Stagg had attempted to enter the park on the day of Rachel's murder. As a 27-year-old man leading a secluded life, Stagg had lost his job and was struggling to make ends meet. He owned a dog that he walked in Wimbledon Common Park every morning. Stagg claimed that on the day of the murder, he went to the park with his dog, but returned home due to a severe headache. Later in the day, feeling better, he took his dog out again, only to be stopped by the police near the park. Stagg cooperated with the authorities, providing his details and answering their questions. Despite the lack of evidence, the police considered him a viable suspect, especially under the pressure from the media. Stagg was taken into custody for 3 days, during which he maintained his innocence. However, detectives began to suspect his involvement in the crime. Initially, occult literature was discovered in his residence, aligning with the profiler's recommendations. Subsequently, law enforcement managed to locate 2 women who provided unsettling accounts about Stagg. One woman accused him of indecent exposure in the park. In response, Stagg claimed he was simply sunbathing in a secluded area, and the woman approached him. Another woman disclosed that she had been exchanging intimate letters with him, including his confession of a desire for outdoor sexual activity. Despite these revelations, the police were aware that these circumstantial details would not hold up in court. Consequently, Stagg was released after agreeing to pay a fine for the park incident, although he continued to assert his innocence. Detectives, in collaboration with a profiler, devised an unconventional plan to elicit a confession. A Metropolitan Police officer, using the alias Lizzie James, initiated intimate correspondence with Stagg, claiming to be acquainted with his previous correspondent. Despite the absurdity of the situation, the plan succeeded. Stagg responded to the letters, and their exchanges grew increasingly explicit and deviant. Lizzie portrayed herself as a woman with violent and sadistic inclinations, at times even illegal, and their communications spanned 5 months. Throughout this period, Stagg persisted in his request for an in-person meeting, prompting the detectives to consider it as a potential means to extract a confession. The meeting took place at a park, and Lizzie was not alone, although Stagg was unaware that undercover officers were monitoring them. Lizzie followed the profiler's advice and shared a made-up story about her secret hobbies with Stagg during their conversation. She mentioned that her ex-boyfriend was involved in the occult and that they had performed a ritual sacrifice on a living person together. Surprisingly, Stagg remained composed upon hearing this information. Despite the unusual turn of events, he continued to stay in touch with Lizzie, spending a few more hours together before parting ways. Subsequent meetings followed, leading up to the final stage, a walk in the park. During this time, Lizzie discussed Rachel's murder with Stagg, expressing her desire for him to be the killer due to the thrill it gave her, but to no avail. Stagg apologized for the misunderstanding and denied any involvement in the crime. Despite Lizzie's repeated attempts to elicit a confession, Stagg maintained his innocence. The police operation, spanning 6 months, failed to produce any evidence linking Stagg to Rachel's murder, yet the detectives remained convinced of his guilt. Consequently, Stagg was arrested in August 1993. During the interrogation, he learned the truth. He had unknowingly corresponded with a police officer all along. Excerpts from these letters detailing various perversions were read to him, and he was introduced to the real Lizzie. Stagg was taken aback, but following his lawyer's advice, chose not to respond to police inquiries. Despite hopes that he would confess under pressure, Stagg remained steadfast in his denial. The case proceeded to trial, dragging on for a year while Stagg remained in custody. Ultimately, his legal team dismantled the prosecution's arguments, prompting the judge to acknowledge the excessive nature of the operation involving Lizzie James and the unprofessional conduct of the police. In September of 1994, Stagg was acquitted of all charges and set free. Lizzie James eventually stepped down from her position in the police force, citing severe psychological distress stemming from the failed operation. The authorities, who had poured over £3 million into the investigation, found themselves at a standstill. Not a single suspect had been identified, and the majority of detectives remained convinced that Stagg was the culprit. This sentiment was echoed by the media and the general public, who continued to point fingers at him. Each time he ventured out into the public eye, he was met with scornful glares from onlookers. The entire nation seemed to believe that the killer had evaded justice, fueling the animosity towards Stagg. This state of affairs persisted for years. The Rachel Nichol case remained unresolved, with little effort made by the authorities to pursue new leads. Why, when they were so certain of Colin Stagg's guilt? By that time, Rachel's husband and son had relocated to Europe for various reasons. The constant harassment from journalists, which brought back painful memories of his wife's murder for his son, prompted the move. Additionally, the father felt that London was no longer a safe place for his child, who had been a key witness to the crime. Their exact whereabouts remained unknown, with speculations pointing towards Spain and France. In 2000, Scotland Yard reopened the case and assembled a fresh team to investigate. Despite combing through all available evidence and witness testimonies, they failed to identify a new suspect. It wasn't until 3 years later that they announced the discovery of DNA from an unidentified man on Rachel's clothing. The technology for analysis had only just reached such a level of sophistication, and in 1992 such a breakthrough was simply inconceivable. Even in 2003, the small sample, which took experts 18 months to locate, was insufficient to confirm identity. The data from that sample was only enough to eliminate unsuitable individuals. Then, in 2004, the police finally had a new suspect. His DNA was already in the database, and a comparison with a sample from Rachel's clothes yielded inconclusive results. This man was 38-year-old Robert Napper, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who, at the time, had already spent 10 years in a halfway house. His biography is remarkable in two ways: the brutality of his crimes and the ease with which he eluded justice. Later, as a result, the police faced a public outcry. Napper first came to the attention of law enforcement in 1986. He was then given a suspended sentence for assault with an air gun. In 1989, he broke into a young mother's house and assaulted her. For the next 4 years, there were a series of similar attacks, but the police did not link them together and could not apprehend the suspect. What followed was truly astonishing. Napper confessed to his mother that he had committed all these attacks. She contacted the police and disclosed everything. And what did they discover? No connection between the crimes and the woman's account, so they did not investigate Napper's involvement. The only action the mother could take was to persuade her son to see a psychiatrist. When Napper returned from there, he claimed that the specialist believed he was insane, but took no further action. Shortly thereafter, he assaulted and abused a woman and her child in Crystal Palace Park. This occurred just weeks before Rachel's murder, but once again, the police failed to see the link. This was not the only such attack in Crystal Palace Park, and at some point, the police realized that one man was responsible for the crimes. Based on witness accounts, they created a composite sketch of him. Following the news in the newspapers, a number of Napper's neighbors reached out to the detectives. Each one of them pointed fingers at the man, prompting the police to request a blood sample from Napper. However, he arrogantly disregarded the demand, causing the detectives to abandon their pursuit of him. He simply slipped their minds. In November of 1993, London was shaken by yet another high-profile crime, which was later revealed to be Napper's doing as well. A young mother named Samantha Bissett fell victim to a brutal attack in her own home. Shockingly, the perpetrator did not spare her innocent daughter. The gruesome acts he committed left even the most seasoned detectives appalled. The police photographer who arrived at the crime scene was so traumatized by what he witnessed that he was unable to return to work for several months. Interestingly, the same profiler who had been involved in the investigation of Rachel's murder was also assigned to these cases, firmly believing that they were unrelated. The detectives, convinced of Colin Stagg's guilt in Rachel's case, failed to see any possible connection. Similarly, the investigators working on the Crystal Palace Park attack failed to establish a link. Standing at nearly 190 centimeters tall, Napper did not match the description provided by witnesses, who described the perpetrator as shorter. However, the criminal made a crucial mistake during the assault on Samantha Bissett. He left behind a fingerprint in her apartment that ultimately led to his identification through the database. Napper had previously been fingerprinted after stalking a woman on the streets. It wasn't until May of 1994 that he was finally apprehended. During questioning, he maintained his innocence and remained eerily composed. Inside his apartment, authorities discovered maps of London with markings indicating the locations of the attacks and murders, including the site of Rachel's tragic death. Additionally, they stumbled upon several disturbing notes detailing how to mistreat women. Just before that, a knife was found in the very park where Rachel was murdered. The fingerprints on the handle were a match to Napper's. However, even that did not suffice to sway the detective's belief in Colin Stagg's guilt. Napper, on the other hand, was under suspicion for a period of time in Rachel's murder, but those allegations were swiftly dismissed. Napper claimed he was at work on that day in 1995. He was eventually tried for the murder of Samantha and her daughter. He struck a deal with the prosecution, pleading guilty to manslaughter, and was sent to a closed psychiatric hospital instead of prison. Napper had been diagnosed with several disorders, including Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia. Due to this, he could have avoided prison regardless of a confession. Consequently, the judge sent him to a psychiatric hospital for treatment with no time limit. Subsequently, when detectives sought to question him about Rachel's murder, the doctors prohibited it, fearing it might worsen Napper's mental state. In 2004, a new team of detectives on the Rachel Nichol case finally began to scrutinize Napper as a suspect. After comparing his DNA to a small sample found on the young woman's body, the results were inconclusive. The sample was insufficient to confirm the match, only enough to eliminate other suspects. In Napper's case, the results were not definitive. Investigators continued to delve deeper, utilizing new technology on Rachel's clothing. They discovered a microscopic piece of paint. Experts examined it and determined it matched the paint on Napper's iron toolbox. Prior to his arrest, he worked as a storekeeper for the Department of Defense. It is unclear how he obtained employment there with his mental disorders, but the fact remains he combined assault and murder with his day job. Scotland Yard took 3 years to prepare the case for trial, and in 2007, Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. During the initial court appearance, he entered a plea of not guilty, resulting in the trial being extended for nearly a year. Eventually, Napper accepted the same deal he had been offered 12 years earlier, a plea changed to manslaughter in exchange for a confession. It wasn't until December 18, 2008, 16 years after the murder, that he finally confessed. The verdict did not alter Napper's circumstances. He remained in the same heavily guarded hospital. It is unlikely that he will ever be released, but the news caused quite a stir throughout Britain. The police suffered greatly, focusing solely on Colin Stagg and disregarding other significant leads. The investigation was split into 3 separate lines, with each team of detectives pursuing different suspects, while Napper was behind all the attacks and murders. In 2008, Stagg sued the police department for a record £706,000 for unjustified criminal prosecutions. The Metropolitan Police also issued a public apology to him. He subsequently penned several books about his experiences, detailing what it was like to be accused of murder. Stagg admitted that his life was effectively ruined by journalists and the police for 10 years. After the entire country finally believed in his innocence, he chose to spend all the compensation on travel, luxury cars, and other things that brought him joy. In 2010, a special commission released a report criticizing the actions of homicide detectives, labeling it a catalog of wrong decisions and mistakes. The reason for this is not only the fact that the murder remained unsolved for 16 years, but also that if the police had done their job properly, they could have apprehended Napper before he killed Rachel, Samantha, and her daughter. No disciplinary action was taken, but all the detectives involved in the case retired, and one of the lead investigators passed away. As for Rachel's son, Alex, he did not give his first interview until 2017, 25 years after the incident. He expressed that his upbringing without his mother posed challenges, yet he managed to muster the courage to release the burden and move forward. Just before the interview, he visited the exact location where his mother tragically lost her life, and at that moment, he was able to finally release the heavy baggage of the past. One can only aspire that this narrative, along with others akin to it, will serve as a valuable lesson for law enforcement agencies worldwide. It may be futile to ponder whether the authorities could have rescued Rachel and Samantha, but it is always timely to reflect and take measures to prevent future atrocities. The mysterious tale remained unsolved for a quarter of a century. A young student from an American university vanished after leaving a gathering. Despite having a suspect early on, law enforcement struggled to substantiate their suspicions. Only many years later did a podcaster uncover the chilling specifics of the incident, shedding light on it to a wide audience and compelling authorities to reinvestigate. Kristen Smart, born on February 20th, 1977, in Augsburg, Germany, relocated to the United States with her family at a young age. The family settled in Stockton, California, where her parents worked as teachers for the children of U.S. military personnel. Kristen pursued her education at California Polytechnic University after graduating from high school in 1996. In her free time, she worked as a lifeguard at the campus recreation center. On May 25, 1996, a birthday celebration was held at the fraternity house, which Kristen intended to attend. However, her friends opted out, leading her to go alone. The party was a typical American student gathering with alcohol, music, and fun. Kristen consumed excessive alcohol that night, felt unwell, and attempted to return to her dorm around 2 a.m., struggling to walk. Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, fellow students who had been at the party, encountered her on the street and offered to escort her home. Paul Flores, another student from the party, joined them and volunteered to walk Kristen to her dorm, since he lived closest. Cheryl and Tim bid farewell and departed in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, Kristen was never seen alive again. Initially, her disappearance was not a cause for alarm. It was Kristen's roommate, Margarita Campos, who first grew worried, expecting her friend to return home after the party, which never happened. The situation was further complicated by the fact that all of Kristen's belongings, including her passport, wallet, and bank card, were left in her room, indicating she did not plan to leave. Margarita hesitated to contact campus police until 2 days later, holding on to hope that Kristen would reappear. However, the seriousness of the situation was not immediately recognized by the campus police, who did not take the roommate's concerns seriously. The weekend prior to the U.S. National Day of Remembrance had arrived, a day dedicated to honoring the fallen American servicemen. The local authorities assumed Kristen had returned home, despite leaving behind all her important possessions and documents in the dormitory. The distance from the university to Kristen's hometown was a 7-hour drive, far too long to undertake without money and documents, especially in the dead of night. Days later, the police finally decided to take action and contacted the young woman's parents. Kristen's mother expressed concern, as her daughter had not been home for a while and had not been in touch. This worried call prompted the parents to seek help from the police, who were initially hesitant to launch an investigation, citing the short time since Kristen's disappearance. It wasn't until the 4th day that a search was initiated. Volunteers scoured the area, but to no avail. The first person of interest was Paul Flores, who claimed to have escorted Kristen to her dormitory before parting ways. However, inconsistencies arose in his story, including sightings of him hours after their alleged separation, with injuries that he provided varying explanations for. Despite suspicions surrounding Paul Flores, there was no concrete evidence against him. A month later, the search for Kristen extended to her hometown. Reporters in the area sensationalized the case, drawing parallels between the story and the popular TV show Twin Peaks. They even mentioned supposed psychics who claimed to have already cracked the case. According to their account, the young woman was murdered by two men on campus, then taken to a cliff and thrown into the water. Naturally, these claims led nowhere for law enforcement. A year after Kristen vanished, her parents took legal action against Flores, alleging his involvement in their daughter's disappearance. In 1997, Paul testified under oath, but he only answered one question: his name. For all other inquiries, he invoked the Fifth Amendment, protecting himself from self-incrimination. Paul's parents then sued Kristen's family for emotional distress, but both lawsuits were dismissed. The lack of evidence prevented the police from charging Paul. On May 25, 2002, the 6th anniversary of Kristen's disappearance, authorities officially declared her deceased. Despite years passing, the case remained unsolved. This continued until 2018, when a California resident, Chris Lambert, decided to launch his own podcast series on various crimes. He was just 8 years old when Kristen went missing and vividly remembered the chilling tale from the news. 22 years later, he embarked on his own investigation and was appalled by the police's negligence. Chris began by interviewing all witnesses to the events. University students revealed Paul Flores had a troubling reputation. He had allegedly harassed female students, though no official complaints were made. Chris scrutinized the police's actions and concluded they had made critical mistakes. Detectives didn't visit Paul's father, Ruben Flores, until 2 months after Kristen's disappearance, despite Paul residing there. Immediate investigation of the residence should have been a priority for law enforcement. Upon the arrival of the police to conduct the search, their lack of attention to detail was glaringly obvious. The detectives neglected to bring in a forensic specialist or a police dog trained to detect decomposition. As a result, the search proved to be utterly futile. Furthermore, the detectives failed to inspect the 2 cars belonging to the Flores family, one of which could have been used by Paul to transport Kristen from the campus to her father's residence. Months later, one of the cars was sold, while the other was reportedly stolen. Astonishingly, the police never bothered to visit Paul's mother's house, where a crucial clue was concealed. Chris Lambert unraveled the mystery when he discovered that a woman named Mary Lassiter had rented the house 4 months after Kristen Smart vanished. Inside one of the rooms, she stumbled upon a necklace link strikingly similar to the one Kristen wore, which was also featured in the posters scattered throughout the city. Despite Mary's efforts to hand over the evidence to the authorities, they callously dismissed it and subsequently misplaced it. Additionally, Chris learned that the backyard of Paul's mother's house had always been paved with concrete. However, shortly after Kristen's disappearance, a portion of the concrete was removed and a flower bed was planted in its place. Mary Lassiter recounted a chilling tale to Lambert. She heard peculiar sounds emanating from the flower bed every day at 4:20 a.m. in the morning and 4:20 p.m. in the afternoon, resembling a wristwatch alarm. Eventually, the sound ceased, presumably due to the watch's battery dying. Armed with this unsettling revelation, Chris approached Kristen's mother, who confirmed that her daughter indeed set her alarm for 4:20 a.m. to make it to work at the recreation center by 5 a.m. The airing of Lambert's podcast in 2019 left millions of listeners incensed by the apathy and incompetence displayed by the police. The evidence unearthed by Chris only served to deepen the shock and disbelief among the audience. Despite the abundance of circumstantial evidence, Paul Flores remains at large. Due to public pressure, the police department decided to reopen the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance. The initial step taken by investigators was to search the Flores family's residences and vehicles. Despite the lack of a body, forensic investigators were able to determine the presence of human body decomposition traces in the ground after finally excavating the ill-fated flower bed. On April 13, 2021, Paul Flores and his father were apprehended. Paul was charged with Kristen's murder, while his father was charged as an accomplice. The investigation revealed that Paul allegedly assaulted the young woman after Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson departed, but was met with resistance. This could potentially explain the injuries on Flores's body following the altercation. It is speculated that Paul may have murdered Kristen and transported her body to his residence. Upon witnessing his son's actions, Flores's father allegedly decided to assist in concealing the body. Together, they relocated the young woman to her mother's residence and buried her in the backyard, which was subsequently replaced with a flower bed. At a later time, seemingly fearing police scrutiny, the suspects exhumed the grave and relocated the remains to an undisclosed location. Paul Flores was convicted of first-degree murder by a Monterey County jury and faces a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. His father, Ruben Flores, was charged as an accessory to the crime and could face up to 3 years in prison. Kristen's parents expressed their gratitude to Chris Lambert and all those involved for alleviating their family's anguish. They find it perplexing that even after numerous years since their daughter's disappearance, the case has finally been resolved. One lingering question they have is whether Flores's mother was unaware of her son's actions. The sudden appearance of a flower bed in the backyard did not raise any suspicions in her mind. Alternatively, it is possible that she had been aware of the events of that night all along, but chose to remain silent out of maternal love. It is true that there may be lingering questions without answers. However, the current focus is on a different matter. It is possible that in the future the missing young woman will be located, leading to justice for Kristen Smart.